Hi, my name's Jay Padgett. I'm, for this quarter, interim provost of Stevenson College, along with Alice Yang. That's why I'm here. Welcome to tonight's debate. It's hard to imagine a question that is more interesting or more consequential, so it's nice to see so many people here. The sponsors of tonight's debate are the UCSC Grad Christian Fellowship, the Secular Student Alliance at UCSC, the UCSC InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Stevenson College, the Secular Student Alliance, the Center for Inquiry, and the Institute for Credible Christianity. Over there by the doors are two tables. One belongs to the Secular Student Alliance here, and the other to the UCSC Grad Christian Fellowship. They have materials and would like you to come look at their materials. There is also somebody in the back of the room who's taping this, and if you are interested in getting a video of tonight's debate, you can do that by stopping by at one of the tables over there and signing up. I think they cost $10 or $15 for the Blu-ray. So let me introduce tonight's speakers. Remember, the question is, does ethics need a foundation in God? Speaking for the affirmative, over here on my right, Dr. Peter E. Payne. He has a bachelor's in philosophy from Stanford University, a PhD from Claremont Graduate University. His dissertation was called Design in the Universe, the Design Argument from the Perspective of Natural Law. He spent 21 years with the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship Grad Faculty Ministry, and he's currently Managing Director of the Institute for Credible Christianity. He and his wife Janet have assisted with the UCSC Grad Christian Fellowship since 2007. Peter engaged in a debate here in October of 2011 on the question, does God exist, with the lawyer Eddie Tabash. Speaking for the negative on my left is J.T. Eberhard. He's the author of a popular blog called What Would J.T. Do? And has been a contributing author to atheismresource.com. He's a co-founder of the Skepticon annual conference and was the organizing team leader for that conference from 2008 to 2010. JT joined the Secular Student Alliance in January 2011 as their first high school specialist. He was hired to build a high school program that catered to the specific needs of teenage activists. He continues to be part of the Secular Student Alliance's Speakers Bureau. He is also very good at magic. I just saw him do something very magical a few minutes ago involving the top of a bottle. And he's a trained opera singer and says that he will sing for drinks. Let me explain the format for tonight's debate. Each speaker will get 12 minutes to give an opening. After that, each will have 8 minutes to rebut the opening of the other. And then there will be 8 more minutes where each gets 4 minutes to rebut the rebuttal. After that, we have 10 minutes in which each gets to ask a question of the other, and we hear the response. After all of that, there's 10 minutes for closing remarks, 5 minutes each. When all of that's over, then there will be a period of question and answer between you and the speakers. Those who want to ask questions of Peter are asked to come to this microphone over here, and those of you who want to ask a question of JT, this microphone over here. The organizers ask that we try to withhold any applause in between the beginning when I'm about to sit down, and I think it's nice to applaud, and the end before the question and answer period where it's also nice to applaud. But in between, they ask that we try to refrain from applause so they can just really focus on the debate. So thanks very much, and let's start the debate.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I enjoy these opportunities to interact with a skeptic about an important question. The question tonight is, does ethics need a foundation in God? And I want to start off by emphasizing 3 things up front. The first is that a person can be kind, caring, basically honest and trustworthy without believing in God. It's pretty obvious the atheists can be those kinds of people. That's not the question. Second, a person doesn't need to believe in God to be motivated, to be basically ethical. Studies have shown that people who are basically ethical, kind, caring people tend to be happier than people who are mostly self-centered. So if you want to be happy, it behooves you to be at least basically ethical. Third, there's a significant overlap of commonly shared ethical values across cultures and across religious traditions. So people oftentimes emphasize the differences, but there are also quite a few similarities across cultures. In all cultures, parents care for their children. There's a degree of honesty, love, care that's expected. Trustworthiness amongst people, all those kinds of things are common across cultures. So the question might be asked then, how does one need a foundation in God if all these things are the case? Well, first point I want to make is that an important part of ethics is believing that people are actually responsible for what they do. And I'll just mention this here without going into it very much, but it seems to me that if everything that I do and say and think is determined by prior states of me, then I as a person never really have any control over what I do, even though I think I do. And the difficulty is that although it's a difficult problem for people who aren't materialists, for the person who's the materialist or the naturalist who thinks the physical world's all that's there, it seems to me that there really is no free will, that one has to bite the bullet on that. But that means a significant part of ethics is missing if one decides that that is the case. A second thing to note is that ethics is crucially important both as a social glue within society and also making sense of our lives. So the topic tonight is not just some sort of abstract thing, but if in fact you have a well put together ethical system and you abide by that, your life is apt to have much more sense to you. You're apt to be much more happy, whereas you're confused and everything's up for grabs. That's internally very disturbing for you. One of the difficulties in our current age is even though there's significant overlap amongst cultures, there's also significant differences. And it wouldn't be so bad if there were fundamental principles around which all cultures agreed and we just disagreed in how they work themselves out. But in fact, there are differences in the fundamentals. So it's not as though when you get the fundamentals, there's agreement, there's fundamentals there. The problem for the atheist, I'll come back to this in a second, is if the physical world is all that exists, then there are no values out there. The only place that values have are things that people actually value. So when there's a fundamental difference between cultures about what a value is, there's no way of being able to say this culture is right and this culture is wrong unless you have some principle above that you're able to appeal to. And I already suggested that there are fundamental differences, and it doesn't seem as though that's going to work. So that presents a problem for all of us who want to have an ethical basis for our life, and that we want to believe that things that we hold dear are true. Not just simply things that are true for us that I value. What I want to believe that the things I pursue are things which really do matter. That I ought to behave in this way rather than just my society says I ought to behave in this way. So if one embraces ethical relativism, there are serious consequences for that, both for society. It's harder for society to hold things together. It's difficult for us as a very diverse society to hold things together. And one of the challenges is how can we get people to live together in harmony when there are significant differences amongst them, but there's also problems internally. So it's important to figure out what I believe and have some basis for it, because if one simply buys into religious pluralism, even though I can be motivated to be a kind, caring person, that doesn't really help me believe that there are right things that matter beyond that. Or when I'm called to make costs beyond what simply are in my own self-interest, why should I do that if I don't really believe that there's any right to it? It's just society has told me to do this, or certain values have been inculcated into me. Something else I want to emphasize in this is that beliefs, values, and norms hang together are very important for all of us. Norms typically are say, don't do this, do that. So do not engage in infanticide is a norm. Probably need a stronger word than that for people who are strongly opposed to it. But it's a norm, but behind that is the value of human life. So if you don't have values behind norms, then it's kind of the police say that do this, or the government says do this, and you don't believe it makes any sense. You'll ignore it probably. But if you have values behind it, then you're motivated for that. But for your values also need to stand on something. If you simply say, well, I value human life, that's a value for me, but I don't go a step further and say, well, human life itself is valuable, if I don't have that belief, it tends to undercut the strength of the value that I have. So typically values, whatever we have, are undergirded by beliefs, and if those beliefs aren't there, the values themselves are rather precarious. Imagine a person who is, say, has religious parents, and those parents have values that are rooted in their religious beliefs, and they seek to inculcate those values into their son. And as their son grows up, they successfully inculcate those values into the son. But the son doesn't go along with the religious beliefs. So he does have these internalized values, but doesn't really have a foundation for it. I mean, maybe the internalized value is I should wait until I get married to have sex. And they feel pretty strongly about that, so that's internalized value. But if there's not a belief that I ought to do this or I need to do this, the value becomes rather precarious. So it's important that values have beliefs behind them. So when we think about the importance of God, if one doesn't believe in God, my suggestion is you need to have some kind of belief that will give the strength and stability behind your values that the religious beliefs actually provide. Now, one thing which I want to emphasize at this point is that ethical claims intrinsically involve the belief that what you're affirming is true not just for you, but for everybody. So if a person makes the claim and infanticide is wrong, they're not simply saying that I disapprove of it, my culture disapproves of it, and I'm advocating that everybody should disapprove of it. When they say it's wrong, they think it's wrong, and they think people ought not to do it. And when you say, what do you mean they ought not to do it? You mean you don't want us to do it? Well, yes, but you ought not to do it. So ethical beliefs have this ought, which is simply this unconditional imperative that you ought to do it. And if a person has an ethical belief, they have to believe that it applies independently of what people think. Most atheists I know have ethical values. Take an atheist who believes that women ought to get paid equal pay for equal work for men. Now, they believe that people ought to do that. That's the right thing to do. But you ask them, well, suppose you changed your view on this and you didn't agree with that. Would that make it okay for women to get unequal pay for equal work? They would say, of course not. It's just the right thing. So when a person holds to a right view, even if they're an atheist, they're not going to say, well, if other cultures don't agree with it, then it's okay for them to believe differently. If you really think that, it's not an ethical claim. So part of the nature of ethics is it has this unconditional ought. There is a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who once gave a lecture on ethics, called his lecture on ethics. And he says there's two kinds of ought. There's a conditional ought and an unconditional ought. The ought is always conditional to some frame of reference. So if a person says you ought not to drive more than 55 miles an hour in this zone, the ought is conditional upon, well, that's what the law says. But if the person says there are no police around here and nobody cares, okay, then it's ought just simply conditional upon it and say ought to. Well, I don't care about obeying the law, you might say. But an ethical ought is something which is unconditional. It doesn't matter whether people think you ought to adhere to it. The problem for, the problem for that, for the atheist again, is the physical world's all that's there. The physical world is all that's there, then there are no such things as values out there. And what's of value are simply the things that people happen to value. Now, there are many atheists who simply bite the bullet on this and say it's true. Ethical relativism is the case, and there's we have 12 minutes. Okay, that's right. All right, I was checking my watch. Okay, good. So watch my time here. So the atheist says that there's no right and wrong out there, simply what people desire to believe, and many atheists grant that. But the problem is they can't, in themselves, actually make ethical claims without being dishonest, because ethical claims believe that everybody ought to do it. And there are very few atheists who actually engage in that. I haven't said anything about non-theistic religions, so let me say something really quick about that, because I'm claiming that ethics needs a foundation in God. Non-theistic religions typically believe that right and wrong is based not in a personal entity of being God, but in an order within nature. So there's a belief that there's a Tao or a moral order within nature. The Greeks believe that there is this order built into us as human beings. There's a nature that we have, and that people ought to abide by that moral order which characterizes the nature of human beings. If you live in accordance with this moral order, your life will go more smoothly. If you don't, there will be internal strife or problems for your life. So typically non-theistic religions base morality in a moral order within nature. The advantage of that position is that it has, in fact, some objective truth to it. So is there objective right and wrong in non-theistic religions? Yes, there is. The problem that I have is twofold. One is it doesn't seem to me that nature is moral at all, that it cares at all about morality. It is true that we have resources within nature for us to live, but it doesn't seem as though nature is somehow benevolently giving it to us, that nature desires our well-being. It doesn't seem to me that a natural impersonal order has any idea of what we need, is able to calculate that, and is able to work things out for our benefit. Plus, I have no idea of how impersonal force could ever engage in exercising plans, having intentions, and seeking to make our lives better. So when people say there's an impersonal moral order, I kind of think, how could that possibly be? There's a disconnect. Too much of morality is connected with circumstances that apply to a person being able to see what's going to happen in the future and actually do the right thing in relationship to that. And a personal order simply can't do that. So it seems to me that a personal order is not going to work. If there is a moral order within nature, as many Christians believe, it has to be a moral order which is instituted by a personal agent. Seems to me that's the only adequate foundation for God. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
There's something in us when we read about various horrors, whether we read them in the news, whether we read them in our holy books. An example would be Exodus 35:2 in the Bible, which says to kill anybody who works on a Saturday. It's very explicit about that. There's something in us that enables us to say, when we read these things, that this is not moral. This was never moral. Now, Peter thinks we owe it to a deity, but I think an answer exists that is far more reasonable and supported by far more evidence. I say that all we need is reason, compassion, and a desire to be happy. So how do we resolve questions of ought? Just in general. Ought you to change the oil in your car? Well, if you want your car to run, you ought to change the oil in your car. But what if you're testing an engine that's supposed to be able to run without oil? Well, then you ought not to change the oil in your car. And this is how we resolve pretty much every question of ought. It's all based off something we want. If you want to be clean, you ought to take a shower. If you want to attract flies, you ought not to take a shower. And even religions are based this way. This is why they create a heaven that everybody wants to go to and a hell that nobody wants to go to. Because that's how they appeal to people like me when they tell us that we need to abide by the 10 Commandments. If you abide by the 10 Commandments, you go to heaven. If you don't, you go to hell. This can be turned on its head by saying, what if I want to go to hell? What if heaven sounds really boring to me and hell sounds like where the party is? What ought I to do then with regards to the 10 Commandments? Well, clearly I ought to disobey them to get what I want. You can't possibly tell me that I should follow the 10 Commandments even though it's going to make me miserable. So in order to figure out what we ought to do morally, we need to figure out what desire moral commandments satisfy in us. And I think it's a pretty simple answer. We all want to be happy. And this is why we have jobs we hate, right? Because we'd be happier having a roof over our head and food in our mouths. And this is, you can't really get away from this because it's literally what it means to make a choice. Every time you make a choice, you're doing what you think will get you what you want the most, by definition. So you're always searching for what will get you what you think you want the most. So it's hard to get away from this idea that we're not, or it's hard to attach to the idea that we're somehow not pursuing happiness, even when we're pursuing our moral commandments. So just like we acknowledge that if we want our car to run, we ought to change the oil, once we realize that if we want to be happy, it's time to start insisting that we and our neighbors live in particular ways that maximize our happiness. I'm assuming they want to be part of our society. Once we make the baby step toward deciding it would make us less happy to live in a world where people regularly killed their neighbors, raped their pets, and stole their pornography, then we immediately have all the motivation we need to conceive of moral rules, i.e., I won't steal from you if you won't steal from me. Now, the first objection we usually hear to this, and we actually heard it in Peter's opening, is without God, our morals are subjective. They're just a matter of mere opinion. Slavery was good one year, but next year we may just need to ban it. And buying a child an ice cream cone is objectively no more moral than the Holocaust. But just because we don't have the means to maximize human happiness entirely figured out doesn't mean that questions of what maximize human happiness are subjective. For instance, take chemistry. This is about an objective fact about the universe as you can get, how elements interact with each other. And that's why we invented the periodic chart, to try and reduce that to something we can understand. But the periodic chart has gone through several different variations over the years as we have refined our understanding of chemistry. And nobody thinks for a moment that just because we're refining our understanding about chemistry, No one thinks that means that our opinions about chemistry are subjective or that the laws that govern chemistry are subjective. And the fact that we're still refining our understanding about what makes humans happiest doesn't mean that the assertion that, say, giving a sandwich to a hungry person is not objectively better for maximizing human happiness than, say, setting them on fire. Exaggerations like this show that we can tell the difference objectively. And all we do from there, in fact, all we've ever done from there, is just refine, refine, refine. Slavery, it turns out, was never the best way to maximize human happiness. We were wrong about that. Just like we were wrong about other objective facts like the flatness of the earth. We were wrong about slavery as a moral good. So let's not confuse the ability of human beings to be wrong with regard to the physical facts about the universe with the physical facts of the universe being subjective. Because humans lack omniscience, just like our understanding of physics, our understanding of what maximizes human happiness will never be perfect. Now, this doesn't represent some intractable problem for secular moral systems any more than our limited understanding of disease in ages past presented a problem for the doctors who were pointing out to the Christians insisting that diseases were the result of demonic possession, that they had no evidence to support that claim. In fact, I'm aware of no objection to secular morality that is both a legitimate problem and that is also solved by appealing to theistic and religious moral systems. Theism alone cannot serve as a moral system or even as a moral foundation, because whether a God exists is a separate issue from what that God thinks about morality, which is also a separate issue from whether or not we know what this God thinks, which is still a separate issue from whether or not this God is correct with respect to our morality. I mean, this is, after all, how we tell an all-powerful God from an all-powerful monster. Where the edicts of a God mirror compassion, God is benevolent. When those edicts are malicious, they do not suddenly become moral because a supremely powerful being commanded them. It makes absolutely no sense to call a God who conceived of cancer and who watches genocides with indifference benevolent, even if it's asserted that such a God also told us not to steal. If you redefine benevolent to include such a God, you've made the word all but meaningless. And curiously, moving from theism to actual religions doesn't solve the problem, it amplifies it, which is why there are thousands of denominations of Christianity and tens of thousands of religions which don't agree about morality, amongst other things. Morality, as I use the term, is about well-being. It's not about, nor does it require, an externally intended purpose, any more than our health requires a purpose. If someone means something else by the term, then we're clearly not talking about the same thing. Our well-being is what I'm interested in. Defining morality as what God wants or in accordance with God's nature is simply cheating in an unsupported assertion, and it means you're talking about something different than I'm talking about. Not only does the system I'm advocating require no appeal to God, it would make no sense to give God the credit for it even if you tried. If moral rules are conceived by people from different cultures without supreme knowledge about what maximizes human happiness, then we'd expect some disagreement on what the moral rules should be. However, if a God created the moral rules, then we'd expect there to be much more agreement on them, since God could have made the moral facts of the universe as undeniable to us as the fact that gravity exists. Why would a God create moral rules he wanted us to follow and then leave us so confused about what so many of them are? What's more, compassion-based morality exists quite clearly in other animals. Piranhas, for example, bloodthirsty as hell while they're feeding, but they don't eat each other. In 1964, Jules Masserman did a study on rhesus monkeys, where he put a bunch of these monkeys into a cage and arranged it so that in order to be fed, they had to pull a lever that would shock one of their cage mates. And these monkeys started starving themselves, some of them up to 14 days, just to avoid hurting their cage mates. Now, piranhas and monkeys and all these other animals don't believe in God in the slightest, so there must be something in their neurochemistry that motivates them to care about compassion. Now, the explanation for this is simple in terms of biology. Species that felt no remorse for harming one another would die out, leaving us only with species that aren't inclined to harm one another and which are naturally motivated towards teamwork. Once you concede that an aversion to killing each other is good for survival, which I hope we can all concede that, you admit that this is precisely what we'd expect to see in a godless universe. It makes no sense to credit God for natural processes like evolution by natural selection, which require no appeal to God at all. Also, if a God exists, it has given us tendencies that compete with what makes us optimally happy. An example is being out of shape objectively makes people less happy. Yet anybody who has ever been on a diet knows how hard it is to avoid eating delicious food in the short term, and lots of it. Now, unless God is a practical joker in very poor taste, this is absolutely bizarre on theism, but again, makes perfect sense on naturalism. On theism, we'd also expect to see some justice in the world beyond what human beings create. After all, why would God make moral rules if he's not going to enforce them? Like what Peter brought up with the speed limits. What sensible lawmaker makes speed limits and then makes no penalty for breaking them? You might as well have no law in place. However, on naturalism, we'd expect the only justice we see to come from humans, which is precisely what we do see. Now again, you could say that God has chosen to orchestrate justice through humanity, but then he's chosen to design a world that looks precisely like one in which he doesn't exist. In fact, even if propositions from our various religions like Christianity were true, there's no guarantee that justice will be meted out even in any other life, since a person, in terms of Christianity, could live a life of complete slaughter and have a deathbed conversion 5 minutes before he died and wind up in paradise, where someone like me, who's at least never killed someone, could wind up in hell for all of eternity. Now, the question today is, do ethics require a foundation in God? I think I've shown that morality founded on our well-being is rooted in discoverable truths about what maximizes human happiness, and these are not contingent upon any God. Not only are gods not required, the existence of God adds no useful information to the discussion, and even if God were to tell us directly its views on morality, those views stand or fall based on the evidence, not on the author. Whether or not a God conveys views on morality, we're still forced to use our brains and our empathy to determine whether or not the claims are reasonable and true. I'm always curious how Christians, for example, determine that God is the good one while Satan is the evil one, without simply asserting that it's true. What was their standard of evaluation? Because using God as a standard is circular reasoning. Meanwhile, I'm free to evaluate both of them and find both of them to be horrible moral foundations, whether they exist or not. Thank you.
It's surprising to me to think that he thinks the moral ought tells you what you want to do. And if you do what's going to make you happiest, that's what you ought to do. Nowhere is an ethical system designed to help people be happiest themselves. In fact, we teach people moral laws not to help them do what they want to do anyway, but so they do good for other people when it's not in their own best interest. It's simply not the case that it's always in my best interest to care for other people, to go out of my way to help people. And he says it's always what maximizes happiness. He's completely ignoring the fact there's personal happiness and there's social happiness. What constitutes happiness for the greatest number of people is not necessarily what's happiness for me. In fact, if I do what society tells me I ought to do, it may cause considerable unhappiness on my part. But if I'm an ethical person, I'm willing to make sacrifices. But why should I be willing to make sacrifices? It's just because of happiness. We're trying to maximize happiness. Plus the question is, why should I care about the happiness of society? There has to be an ought related to that says I ought to do it whether or not I want to. So it's not the case the ought is simply what maximizes happiness. Plus the question, how do you measure the maximization of happiness? Within the West, due to the Christian influence, there's this idea that every individual human being is of great and a roughly equal worth. So even utilitarianism says we want to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. The assumption is that every person has one vote. So every person's happiness is worth every other person's happiness. But where does that come from? Does it come from reason? No, it doesn't. Does it come from the idea that overall society will be happier? No. You can easily argue that society would be happier if we got rid of people that cost us a lot, who have disabilities that cost us a lot of money. Just get rid of them and everybody else would be happy. Well, you might say they would feel guilty about that. Why would they feel guilty about that? Not if everybody approves of it. So it's simply not the case that that ethics is a matter of what's going to make me happy. He makes a distinction and says there's no difference between an ice cream cone and a Holocaust. No, there's a huge difference with that. As I said, where there's human beings, we all share values in common, and we recognize that giving an ice cream cone to a child is something which the child will appreciate and I will appreciate. But when it comes to something like the Holocaust, we have horror at that, and there's a natural horror to that. But at the same time, we recognize it's wrong. And the question is, am I willing to risk my life to try to stop Hitler? Would I be willing to go in an effort to try to kill him, recognizing that I likely am going to be killed in the process? Is that going to result in my greatest happiness? No, doing the right thing does not equate with what is in your greatest happiness. He says that it doesn't, when you try to figure out what God wants, you simply ask, well, what does God want? That sometimes it's presented what's called the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma says that God wills, he asks the question, does God will what he wills because it's good, or is it good because God wills it? And I would say that the answer to that is all good comes from God, but our understanding of what God is does not come from God telling us what he wills. Rather, God's created us with a conscience, he's creating us with desires, we recognize what contributes to human welfare, and we look and say, does God care about human welfare? And as a Christian, we say, yes, in fact, he does. As after we believe that God cares about human welfare and he cares about us, as Christians make the affirmation, given what God has revealed to us, that he's perfectly good. Now that raises questions about why would God do some of the things which are in the Bible. But in fact, that's not the fundamental of the question. The question is, do I need some source beyond myself that's going to give me a standard of right and wrong? If I don't have it, then I don't have a belief that there really is right and wrong. To believe that something is going to bring my own greatest happiness does not make it right for me. Even if I believe something is going to bring our greatest happiness for other people, why should I care about that? That's the dilemma. You have to have some foundation for morality. If it's not God, there has to be some secular foundation for it. The way in which I thought JT would probably go to say, well, there is objective foundation to human happiness. It's not just a blank slate, and ethics isn't just anything you put into it. So a person who says, I value egocentrism and doing everything which in my own interest, that's not an ethical value system. Ethics has to do with concern for other people. That's part of the definition of ethics. And a person might say, well, the definition of ethics is concern for human welfare, and human welfare isn't a blank slate. Some things in fact contribute to human welfare, other things do not. So you can get a certain amount of objective content to that, which I think is objective content to right and wrong. But when you go beyond that and you say, what is in fact that I ought to do when it costs me something, or when it's not to my advantage, that's where it becomes much more difficult. And as a Christian, we come back and say, God has willed, God knows me better than I know myself, and hence I can trust him. He said that God is malicious. Nowhere does the Bible say that God is malicious. It does say that God is opposed to evil and can quite strongly express his opposition to that and destroy people who are evil. But to say he's malicious is to read into something the Bible simply doesn't teach about it. To say that, let's get another example here, that God's conceived of cancer. No, God doesn't conceive of cancer. I think there's cancer that developed, but there's no indication that God created cancer. I believe that there's lots of things that developed over a course of time which weren't part of God's original creation. And when God created Adam and Eve, he had created them with protection. When he sent them out of the garden, they were in a world where perhaps cancer already existed, but then they faced a world within which there's hardships. So God does not create cancer to make things difficult for us. God, in fact, cares for us very, very deeply. He says there's no legitimate problem at all when it comes to ethics. Well, I think the legitimate problem is that we need to have values which will motivate us to do things which aren't in our interest. And to think that's not a problem for society, if he thinks society should just have everybody do what they want, I fear to look what society would look like if everybody's following his maxim that you should do what's in your own interest, your own happiness. It's an ethic of self-interest. Well, an ethic of self-interest means that when you get people to do things they want, you want them to do, they don't want to do, you have to rely on the police to do it. So rather than having people do things because it's the right thing as a moral people, everything you want them to do that's not in their own happiness, you have to put in a law, so it becomes a police state. Hardly is that a society where we want. An ethical system that works within society is where people do the right things even when it's not in their own interest, but they feel satisfaction in doing those right things because of the fact that, because they believe it's right. If in fact they think I'm doing this because society wants me to do it, there's no satisfaction thinking about I did the right thing. For instance, when I get to the end of my life, I want to say I was a person who lived by the right thing and did the right thing. But if they're just believing I want to get to the end of my life and I believe what my society told me to do, but other societies don't tell me to do that, what satisfaction is there in that? So in fact, there's no satisfaction in that whatsoever. So when it comes down to motivation and ethics, we have to ask, why is that we're motivated? I think there's several things that motivate us. He assumed that motivation for a Christian is just heaven and hell. That's not the case. If a person is motivated by hell, he's not going to actually be motivated to love other people. God calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Well, if you know you're going to go to hell, is that going to make you love your neighbor? No, it's not. What makes you love your neighbor is realizing God loves you. and receiving love for other people. It's that relationship with God that motivates you. And it's true that people can, in the short term, be motivated by negative things, but in the long term, they're motivated by love from others and love from God. So the question is, what motivates the atheist? Is it simply his own happiness? He ought to be motivated for wanting to do what's right, but there's no grounds for wanting to do what's right other than his own personal happiness. So that's the fatal fault with the atheist position. Well, actually, my time is up, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. In his opening, Peter said that a problem with a naturalist position is that he would never have any control over what he did. I said it seems there would be no free will. And while in terms of neuropsychology and cognitive neuropsych, the vote is still out on whether or not we have free will, even if we don't have free will, so what? You don't need choice to value certain things. You don't need choice to value happiness in yourself and in others. So this doesn't present a problem against my position. He says if a physical world is all that exists, there are no values. But that's simply not the case. There was once a time when we hadn't explained anything. And ever since that time, quite literally, everything we've explained has been found to be the product of mindless forces acting upon inanimate objects. A natural world is all we see, and yet we do have values. And those values, like compassion, which I talked about in my opening, are completely explicable through natural processes like evolution by natural selection. The fact that you value the beauty of stars, or that you value the taste of pizza, these things are explicable through natural means. So the idea that we can have values if a natural world is all that exists is somewhat bizarre. He has said, why should I act in pure self-interest? And frankly, you have no choice. Remember what I said in my opening. Every single time you make a choice, you're doing what you think will get you what you want the most. Now, you can be wrong about what will get you what you want the most. I thought going to prom would make me happiest when I was in high school. Wrong. We can be wrong about these things. But it doesn't change the fact that every time you make a choice, you're still doing what you think will get you what you want the most. So you really have no option but to act out of self-interest. I said you should have values beyond social norms. The example he gave was that value of life prevents infanticide. Well, yes, you do have to have values before you form moral rules like norms. But when we base them off compassion, they're always going to be in the interest of what makes a better world. In terms of what he said, what if those values come directly from God? I mean, God's not necessarily good. God could tell us the opposite. He could tell us to value wiping out whatever societies disagree with your religion. He could tell us to value destroying the infidel. You do have to have values behind norms, but theism doesn't give us necessarily any better values for those norms than secularism. In fact, compassion, I think, gives us the greatest possible values to inform our moral norms. Where God's values differ from compassion and what's best for humanity, he's clearly not our friend. He says it's important that values have beliefs behind them. Well, what belief caused you to value the taste of pizza? Anything? There are some things we value, some desires that are just intrinsic to us. Now, our beliefs still change that, but I would argue that beliefs without reason can make a complete mockery of compassion. For instance, how many of you, just by show of hands, have ever read a story in the news of a child who died of a completely preventable illness? Leave your hands in the air if that was because the parents, instead of choosing to summon an ambulance, decided to pray. You can read these stories in the news every few months, and if the word bad is to have any meaningful definition, parents that pray while their children die and essentially kill them through neglect are bad. But you know what strikes me when I read those articles in the news? How similar I am to those parents. Because those parents loved their child as much as I would love my child. They wanted their child to get well as much as I would want my child to get well. The problem with them wasn't that they didn't have any beliefs behind their morals. It was that they had bad beliefs, inaccurate beliefs. And this is why I advocate compassion with reason. If you have compassion but no reason, you can wind up murdering your child even as you cared for them. And if you have reason without compassion, you can become a maniac and a tyrant. We need both of them. So I think you should have beliefs behind your morals, but I think those beliefs should make sense. And if you're talking about a God who decided to give us moral rules and then leave us confused about them, or if you're talking about a belief that requires believing that the natural law of the universe was suspended so your Savior could walk on water and rise from the dead, I would argue you're failing that moral obligation to be reasonable, and that your beliefs, therefore, are immoral. He said, ought is unconditional. Well, no, it's not at all. Ought's conditional upon what we want. If you want your car to run, you ought to change the oil. If you want your children to live when they have a preventable illness, you ought to call an ambulance. Oughts are completely conditional. If you're in Nazi Germany and the Gestapo knock on your door and ask if you're harboring Jews, while you may think that lying is a sin, the moral thing to do in that condition is to lie your ass off. He said, suppose you change your view on equal pay. He said the atheist would say, well, of course it's not the right thing to say that women shouldn't get paid different. It's just the right thing to do. That is not at all what I'm advocating. I'm arguing that the physical properties of the universe and of the way societies work, objective facts about the way societies work, suggest that when people are treated equally, societies thrive, and therefore we thrive as individuals within those societies. He said the speed limit, the ought is conditional upon what the sign says. No. The sign could say, murder your children. We wouldn't obey it just because the sign says it, or because, as he repeatedly says, our society tells us to do so. What we ought to do is based on what is most reasonable given the facts about the universe and what maximizes human happiness. He seems to think that societies can't, or that the atheist is saying that societies can't be wrong about that when they can, and they have been. It's up to us to keep refining our position and to keep being reasonable about what we want and keep trying to discover new ways to maximize human happiness, and not just doing what the sign says because it tells us to do so. He says that on theism, and this was actually the only piece of evidence he gave for the need for a theistic God, he said, on theism, people must abide by a natural or moral order. I think this is a redefinition of morality. When I say it, I'm talking about the well-being of human beings. Now, if the natural moral order he spoke of is synonymous with what maximizes human happiness, awesome, we're talking about the same thing. But if he's talking about some set of rules that he thinks exist in nature, some of which might stand in opposition to maximizing human happiness, I would, one, burden him to establish how he knows that these natural moral rules exist, or even how he knows what they are. But I'd also burden him with explaining why, even if he could establish that those exist, why we should follow them, why those are necessarily correct when even we could come up with better ideas for what maximize our own happiness. He said that natural order must be instituted by a cognitive mind but outside of humanity. Well, consider all the evidence against that position. How many of you in this room believe that sulfur smells bad? Right? Sulfur is what makes your fart stink, for the record. All right, sulfur smells terrible. Yet, God has made it so clear that sulfur smells terrible that everybody in this room, and pretty much everyone who smells sulfur, will realize that sulfur smells terrible. Yet, in terms of his moral rules, he's made them so confusing that people across the world are confused about what they should be. Now, if human beings are creating moral rules and then arguing about what they should be, this is what we'd expect. But why is sulfur smelling bad so much more an important fact that God gave us irrefutable proof of that than what his moral rules should be? The idea that... Oh, stop now. Thanks, everybody.
It's amazing to me that when he says, I was saying values don't exist, values for the atheist only are what people happen to value. Okay? And he didn't deny that at all. He didn't say there's any value. So when people disagree about what they happen to value, there's no right or wrong with that. When one person says, this is what I value, this is another person value, well, you say we ought to value compassion, and one of you doesn't value compassion. But there's no neutral ground that says you ought to value compassion. You might say, well, greatest happiness. Well, where's the value that says everybody should seek greatest happiness? Where is that? Some people value maximizing happiness, other people do not. So the only values from an atheistic standpoint are the things which people choose to value. And then he said, amazingly, that people always do what they want to do. So they're always doing what they think is their own interest. And they can't help it. But then he says, when a Gestapo is at your door and they're asking, are there any Jews hidden here? Of course you say, yes, there are no Jews here. Well, why do you risk your life for the sake of these people? Why is it that you would choose to do that? I would say that there's an ought here, that you ought to do it regardless of whether or not you want to save the Jews' lives. So to say that you ought to do it because it's showing compassion, there's no ought from a secular standpoint that you ought to show compassion. True, showing compassion may help other people, but showing compassion only helps you if it's showing compassion to people that relate to you. For you to show compassion to people who are halfway around the world is not going to affect you at all. So it's not the case that what is in your own interest is going to be what's ethical. So in no ways is shown that, in fact, there's an ought. He says there is no ought, or somebody says there is no ought, and then, of course, you ought to do what's compassionate. He says you ought to do what's reasonable. What's reasonable when the Gestapo knocks the door? So the reasonable thing is to say they're not here, and the reasonable thing is to hide them. Well, why is the reasonable thing to do what's going to risk your life? It's only if you think it's right to do it. If you don't think there's no right involved in that, then in fact, you can do whatever you want. So if people do what they want, there's no right and wrong, and he says there is. He says we've discovered value through science. We discovered that people want things and value things. Yes, in fact, that's true. And we've discovered that sometimes people value being kind and compassionate to each other. That has some value. But it doesn't mean that when I'm chosen between when motivation to be compassionate and motivation for my own interest, that I ought to be compassionate. But he somehow thinks that reason tells us that we ought to be compassionate. It's simply not the case. Then he says, where do rules come from? From God. Well, I think God has given us plenty of rules. He hasn't answered all the difficult questions. For a person who says we need to appeal to human welfare, I think there's quite a bit you can get from human welfare if you buy into this Christian notion that everybody is of equal worth and great worth, which is something which he hasn't shown. Where does that come from a secular standpoint? But as Christians, we believe that God, in fact, cares about us and for us. We do have a basis for this, whereas for the atheist, there's really no basis for saying this is what we ought to do. He said, I appeal to a natural order. Actually, my point was I don't appeal to a natural order. If there's a natural order, all is because the personal God has created us. I don't think that nature itself is going to give you anything that's right. He appeals to animals doing things which are ethical. Well, animals do lots of things which they do, but they're not either ethical or unethical. There's no right or wrong about that. That's just the way they are. And the same thing should be true of people. Sometimes being selfless maximizes the replication of your genes. Sometimes being immoral maximizes the replication of your genes. Nature doesn't tell you what you ought to do. Reason doesn't tell you what you ought to do. Thank you.
Okay. In his first rebuttal, he said it's not always in my best interest to do what makes me happiness. And he talked about personal happiness versus societal happiness. He doesn't realize, or at least doesn't seem to realize, that the two are interconnected. How many people think smiles are contagious? How many people get sad when they see other sad people? Or how many people, when you see a horror movie and see people suffering, kind of clench up like that? Now, no one thinks for a moment that that represents real human suffering, but it still affects us in very real ways. And this should establish for you that our own happiness is dependent on other people's happiness. And even all of you are more happy living amongst a society and getting along with everybody else. I mean, as long as you like using cell phones in grocery stores, you realize how important it is to get along with everybody else. So your personal happiness and societal happiness are actually intertwined, if nothing else, because you live in the society that you create. I said, another problem is, how do you measure happiness? Well, it's not a perfect science, but being imperfect doesn't necessarily make it incorrect. We have so far been imperfect of realizing how the periodic chart should be, and it will go through other variations. It's not that chemistry is incorrect, it's simply that our understanding of it is imperfect. So this doesn't actually present a problem for me. He said, if you're maximizing human happiness, why not just get rid of people with disabilities? I feel somewhat strange having to explain that getting rid of people with disabilities creates a discordant society where people live in fear. Same effect when you put people into slavery or oppress minorities. It creates a chaotic society that is liable for rebellion, and none of those societies throughout history have been happier than societies where you take care of the sick and where you care for the people around you. I said, am I willing to risk my life to stop Hitler? I look at morality in terms of a chess game. Mid-game, there is objectively a best move. There are lots of good moves, and there's objectively a best move. Now, we may not know what is objectively the best move, but we can still separate good moves from bad moves. And just because we can't determine what is right in every case, we're still refining it. having some gray area doesn't mean that the system is incorrect. It just means we still have refining to do. So in terms of am I willing to risk my life to stop Hitler, if you value living more than you value stopping suffering in others, you're not going to risk your life to stop Hitler. And there's nothing anyone can say, any person, any God, that's going to change your mind. It's simply the way it is. I said God created us with a conscience. He didn't give any evidence for that assertion, so I reject it. What's more, as far as our conscience goes, I gave evidence in my opening. Natural selection is more likely to produce compassion and teamwork and tendency towards teamwork as a survival mechanism. It's also produced teamwork and compassion in animals that share a vast amount of our DNA. So the evidence on terms of where our conscience comes from is totally in my camp right now. What's more, in terms of God making us with a conscience, you guys have read the Old Testament. Why would God make us with a conscience that revulses even when people suffer in horror movies and then command us to kill other people? That's absolutely bizarre on theism. Why not just make us want to kill certain people and not make us suffer through the problems of conscience when we do it? I said ethics equals a concern for other people. Yes. I said nowhere does the Bible say that God is malicious. I'm sure the Bible doesn't say God is malicious, but it also says he watched while his son died in excruciating death when he could have absolved humanity by, say, blinking his eyes, what with being all-powerful and everything. He gave us commands like kill everybody who works on a Saturday. If the Bible doesn't say that God is malicious, the Bible is lying. Said God didn't create cancer. Okay, if things can exist that God didn't create, why say that God created anything? Stop now. Awesome.
So now we go to the question and answer period. It lasts 10 minutes. It's between the two speakers. First, Peter gets to ask JT a question in 1 minute. JT gets 4 minutes to respond, and then Peter has 30 seconds when he can optionally respond to that. Then the roles reverse.
My question relates to the contention that the right thing is what promotes happiness. But there are two contentions in what promotes my happiness and what promotes overall happiness. And you said that they oftentimes overlap, but they oftentimes don't overlap. When they don't overlap, is there any ought that says you ought to promote overall happiness at the expense of your own happiness? If not, is it the case that you ought to do what something is in the interest of others when it's not in your own? Or if you're always going with happiness, why not simply go with your own happiness? So when there's a tension between happiness for the group and happiness for yourself, you say that doing the right thing is promoting happiness, but there's no ought that says the group happiness ought to have precedence over yourself. I recognize that caring for the group sometimes feeds back on you. But even taking that into account, there's lots of times where doing from the group will not increase your own happiness. So please answer me, when ethics is based on happiness, and there's a conflict between group happiness and individual happiness, is there a moral answer to how that gets resolved? And is there an unconditional ought in that?
I'm not sure I can think of a situation where personal happiness would be available at the expense of group happiness. Because you live in a society, maximizing group happiness also maximizes your own happiness. I think an example might be, what would I say to the person who says stealing a stereo would make me happy, but it would not maximize societal happiness? And what I would say to that person is, like I said during my rebuttal, we can be wrong about what makes us happiest, which means we need to apply reason to our values to determine the things we even ought to want, because we can be confused about that. I would point out to this hypothetical thief that numerous studies confirm that stealing from other people and mistreating other people objectively result in less happiness to themselves. I would also tell them that they probably had something stolen from them and probably realized how much they hated the person that stole it from them. And if they stole themselves, they would necessarily become the type of person they would hate. And that's no way to live a happy life. I would also tell them that if they want to live in a world where their positions are safe, they have an obligation not to steal from other people. So what I would say to the person stealing the stereo is this. You might think that this is going to maximize your happiness at the expense of society, but if you had a broader basis for comparison and more information, I think reasonably you would have to reject that claim.
Okay, we each have 30 seconds to respond. It seems incredible to me that he cannot come up with any instance where something is going to be in your interest and not in the interest of others. There's lots of instances when that's the case. Suppose you need some money to pay your rent, and you have access to the account in the bank. The bank has lots of money, nobody's going to notice it, and you're absolutely guaranteed, suppose, that it can never be traced to you. And you wouldn't feel guilty about it all, because you hate the bank anyway. So you don't have any guilt about that. Your own happiness is increased, and there's no, you're actually doing what's wrong for the society as a whole, but why is it should be wrong? It seems to be lots and lots of instances where what is in your own interest is not in the interest of others around you. Okay.
Each of our speakers gets a 5-minute closing statement.
I want to say a little bit more about the character of God, because after all, Western ethics is really founded on Christian ethics, and we may not realize it. Take the value that every single human being is of great and roughly equal worth. That is almost uniquely Judeo-Christian value. If you look at other cultures, it's not the case that everyone is of equal worth. Almost always, age, gender, the family you were born into, your social status, your religion, become criteria of how you're treated. Whether it's Islamic countries, the caste system in India, it's not the case other societies view everyone's value as being equal. So should everyone be treated the same? No. Do they take the view that what we should aim for in society is to maximize as much happiness as we can with as many people as possible? No, they don't have that value. Do we say we ought to have that? No, that's not the case. So let me say a little bit about the God of the Bible, or Christianity, Christian view of ethics. Oftentimes people think of Christian ethics as being a matter of list of rules, do's and don'ts. That's not the case. Jesus said the ethics, the law of God, boils down to two things. Love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself, so the law of the prophets are contained within those things. But that's what is the essence of it. It's not as though here's a list of do's and don'ts. In fact, he says at one point to the Pharisees, who are very meticulous about obeying something, he says, you obey these minor laws, but you ignore the weightier things of the law. Where we get this notion that we ought to love our neighbor as ourselves, that comes from Jesus, it comes from the Old Testament as well. There are some statements within other religious traditions where people would say it, but it's not part of the other religious traditions themselves that you need to love your neighbors yourself. So even though you can find it, because I think it's something that we do get from conscience that people can come up with that, it's in the Christian tradition that we have that. So when we look at our values in the West, and even the maximizing compassion for others, that's a Western value, that's something indebted to the Christian faith. And when you say, well, we should just get rid of Christians, the society would be much better if we get rid of that, what you're doing is you're actually wanting to get rid of the people who have beliefs that undergird the values which you want to hold to. And the atheists really don't have bases for the values that they want us to hold to. Say we should be compassionate to everyone, we should maximize happiness. That comes from Christian values and beliefs, but they don't offer beliefs that actually substitute for that and say, well, it'll maximize my own happiness to do that. It's just bunk. It's not true. So we don't have a belief behind it. So I think if one is an atheist and they appreciate Western values, they ought to say, what we ought to do is you ought to try to promote people believing this myth, if you believe it's a myth. Because after all, they're the ones that have the beliefs that undergirded our belief in the value of human dignity. They believe everyone's created in the image of God. Those kinds of things. We ought to encourage them to believe that, because after all, they have more belief behind it than we do. And we want society to be able to sustain it, so we ought to encourage them to believe it, because that'll help get the values that I want sustained. If I don't have those values myself, I don't have beliefs behind it, those values tend to get eroded. Take the value that we have for each individual being of great and equal worth. I think there's nothing that's going to preserve that over time if you don't maintain Christian values. Take the question of infanticide I gave before. At this point, we feel quite comfortable. Most people feel quite comfortable. I don't feel quite comfortable. But if, say, a fetus is discovered to have Down syndrome, now over 90% of fetuses that are diagnosed with that U.S. are aborted. Why? Well, they don't want to have this child they're going to have to care for the rest of their life. It's going to make their life less happy. If you think happiness is the goal, then in fact you ought to approve of that. But if you approve of that, what about the poor woman who doesn't realize the baby has Down syndrome until the baby is born, and the child is actually more developed in the mother's womb who hasn't been born yet? It's okay to kill that baby, but not the baby that's come out, because it's inside outside. It doesn't seem to me that makes any sense whatsoever. If you have a value of human life, you're going to value human life, you're willing to pay the sacrifice for that. But if you don't have any belief that undergirds why it is that every single life should be of value, then when there's pressures that says it's going to cost us an awful lot for society, the only thing that keeps us from going in the direction is the fact that we have this heritage from the West. We're living on the heritage of Christian beliefs, and that's what undergirds our values, and we don't realize that if we cut that off, we're in fact cutting off ourselves a belief system that sustains what we want to believe in the West. If you don't believe that, look at other values around the world and ask, where did our values come from? So whether or not you believe in God, you ought to wish that more people would believe in God. Now, they may not, how you resolve what God does in the Old Testament, Christians have answers to that, but the point is that Christians believe that we really ought to care for other people, and you look at the teachings of Jesus, and that undergirds our values in the West, and to somehow think that getting rid of that is going to help us, no, it's not. It's going to ask people to sustain values that they no longer have beliefs behind them, and when there are pressures against them where it practically costs a lot, the only thing that keeps us from changing those is the habits that we already have, and those habits will erode over time when there aren't beliefs that undergird it. Thank you.
Two things Peter said in his second rebuttal I wanted to hit real quick. He said God has given us plenty of rules. If he's talking about the God of the Christian Bible, I'd say that's true, the Ten Commandments, if you believe that. For a majority of the Ten Commandments, do you know what the penalty at least used to be for not following them? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't a hug. These rules cannot be taken as moral in any sane context. He also said animals do unethical things. I wasn't arguing that we should do what animals do. I was arguing that there's evidence that natural processes gave rise to our conscience and our compassion. If I was saying we should do what animals do, then I would advocate all of us peeing on fire hydrants, but I don't. He said morality is based on the character of God and that everybody has equal worth. If everybody has equal worth, the whole Catholic Church is kind of backwards with the whole idea of priests and bishops and whatnot. But also, I don't think everybody has equal worth. If there's a missile in the air and you have the choice to divert it to a prison full of convicted murderers or a kindergarten, pick one. I mean, human life does have a tremendous amount of value, but to assert that that value is equal across the board is, I don't think, correct. He said, Christianity is not a list of do's and don'ts that you follow about blindly. The story of Abraham makes absolutely no sense then. Abraham is taught in Sunday school as the good Christian because he was willing to abide by God's command, even if it meant gutting his child. In the Christian perspective, Abraham passed the moral test. From the secular human perspective, Abraham could not have failed more purely. If God appeared before me, even though I would know God existed, I would know he was the ultimate power in the universe, and he told me to kill my child, it doesn't become moral just because he commanded it, and I can assure you that the next words out of my mouth would be, fuck you. And if Christianity is just a list of do's and don'ts, the Ten Commandments make absolutely no sense. He said, love your neighbor as yourself is a Christian value. I would argue it's not a moral value. To quote the great Christopher Hitchens, do I love the theocratic suicide murderers? No, I do not. I dislike them. I wish to encompass their defeat. They want to be martyrs? Okay, I'm here to help. But in no sense would it be moral to claim that I should love them. We should care about the happiness of others, but only insofar as, we should care about the happiness of others, but once they've made it clear that they're unwilling to help society become more happy, if they're actually a detriment to societal happiness and our happiness, at that point, if we're doing what maximizes our own happiness, we should lock them in jail or ostracize them from our society, and that's exactly what we see. What's more, when justice is meted out to these people, it's never at the hands of God. It's always at the hands of humans. And frankly, it's imperfect, which doesn't make any sense if God exists and has any interest in justice. And if you think we've caught every priest who's ever forced himself on a little boy, then your optimism has extended well into self-delusion. If human beings had God's omniscience, we would catch them. But we don't, and so justice is imperfect. This is precisely what we'd expect to see in a godless universe. He said, Christians have the values that underscore even secular morality. Not mine. I mean, think about it. Obedience to a particular being just because that being is all-powerful or created the universe. I don't value that. Like I said, if God came to me and told me to kill my child, I would tell him to take a hike. What's more, even the Ten Commandments, no graven images, no blasphemy. I think blasphemy is a spectacular thing. Blasphemy has protected through the ages a bunch of horribly immoral ideas, protected them from criticism, protected us from ever re-examining them. I think even the concept of blasphemy is immoral. So I don't think Christians do undercut my values. Like I said, compassion, reason, and empathy underscore my values. He said, if you don't have any beliefs behind your morals, they erode. Atheists believe things. I'd put my stamp of approval about 90% of the things on Wikipedia, for instance. I believe lots of things. I believe ambulances and doctors are what keep children from dying, even when parents elect to pray. I just don't believe anybody rose from the dead and walked on water, and frankly, I don't need to believe those things in order to care about my own happiness and the happiness of my fellow human beings. And his last example is the Down syndrome baby, born versus unborn. He's leaving out several facts. An unborn baby, prior to the 26th week, can't experience its own demise, can't feel pain. It can no more suffer its own loss than any other cell in your body. However, a fully born baby with Down syndrome can suffer, and so the concerns are different. So to equate the two in terms of what maximizes happiness is really comparing apples and oranges. And what's more, Peter never gave any evidence for any of the assertions he gave about God's existence or what God wanted. You'll note that I gave tons of evidence for a natural universe and for the arisal of our values in my opening.
How about if I just let you go and we give a round of applause for both of them now?
Yay.
So now we go to the real question and answer period that involves you. Just a reminder that this microphone is for questions addressed to Peter. This one for questions addressed to JT. We're going to ask that you keep questions to under a minute. The speakers are asked to keep their answers to under 3 minutes, and then the other speaker gets an optional 1 minute to add on to a comment to the question. So please feel free to come up to the microphones. This is going to be about a 25-minute period.
Peter, I think that you took credit for the Enlightenment values for Christianity, and I think that the real respect for the individual comes from the Enlightenment. And Christianity's zenith was really an era that we call the Dark Ages. In fact, Christianity promotes the hierarchical society because it actually enforces that. There's a supreme God, and we are to be obedient. And that translates down through kings and priests. So it's really taking the historical data and turning it on its head. Plus, I'm not sure I understand the ought in your argument. You're still, I think what I got from you was that it's still to maximize human well-being. It's just that we don't really know what human well-being is, and God does. And so by obeying God, we are maximizing our well-being. And it's not a matter of avoiding heaven or hell, but maximizing well-being through an authority that knows what our well-being is. So it's the same thing, it's just you're saying there's somebody else that knows our well-being.
Okay, there's two questions. I only have 3 minutes.
Sure.
The first one about the individual. If you read in the Old Testament, God did not want there to be a king. He did not want somebody ruling over. And Jesus says, you shouldn't seek to rule over other people. So Jesus was very clear about that. In the Old Testament, God shows great concern for the weak, for the orphan, the oppressed, the people who are lowest in society, and they are of great value in God's eyes. So this value that individual, no matter how insignificant you may be, is very much a biblical notion. When you ask the question about ought and what lies behind it, there's nothing logically that requires anyone to be motivated to say, well, God said this, therefore I ought to believe it. Or this will make me happy, therefore I ought to believe it. But what ought does have some motivational force. You have to say, what lies behind that motivational force? And if it's just simply a habit that you have some value, but you don't have any explanation for why I should be motivated to do it. And I think human welfare is really a lot what lies behind ought. That in fact, we should care about human welfare, and God is the one who knows about human welfare better than any of us. And we should take the advice and counsel that God gives in seeking to work that out. And it is true then in a lot of instances where the person being atheist or a Christian, we're going to have disagreements because we don't have all the bases. But when it comes to fundamental things, as Christians, we have a firm conviction that there's ought, and part of that motivation is wanting to please God. So there's very clear, strong religious motivation. Oftentimes the atheists say, well, there is no real religious motivation, then they can't accuse religion of doing terrible things.
Why do you please God? For your own benefit or for His benefit?
It's actually, when I'm doing things which please God, it's like, why does a child please the parent? Is it for the parent's benefit or is it the child's benefit? It's not for God's benefit. It's for my benefit, the child, but at the same time, God loves me, and He's pleased when I take pleasure in Him. And when the parent tells the child to do things, it's for the child's welfare. Likewise, when God tells us to do things, it's not a dictator, but it's like the parent who is telling the child to do things which will actually be for their benefit. And to follow the parent is actually in the child's welfare, like following God is in our welfare.
No, I'll leave it there.
When he talks about the Christian values underscoring our own morality, human beings have been on this planet for between 100,000 and 200,000 years. Biology's a little fuzzy there. The Old Testament is roughly 6,000 years old. Like, what does he imagine was happening before the Old Testament came around? Were people just punching each other in the face for grins? I mean, we were working together. We had societies. Compassion existed long before that, as did moral rules. He said, God knows human welfare better than any of us. Is there any horror so terrible that it couldn't be justified away that way? I mean, if God watches with indifference while the Holocaust occurs, He knows human welfare better than us, and it must fit into His divine plan. There's no way you could ever accuse God of being a monster that way, no matter how terrible His behavior is. And I think that kind of robs us of our ability to evaluate God as a moral agent. And lastly, he said that he pleases God for His benefit, which seems kind of in line with what I was saying about doing what we think will make us most happy.
Hello. I have a question for the atheist side. You were relating yourself with Abraham in the Old Testament, and you said if God came and said, kill your son, you would say, F you, or take a hike. But if God came and said, I love you, and I sacrificed my one and only son to die for your salvation, how would you reply?
I don't accept the sacrifice, and had I been alive at that time, I would have done everything in my power to stop it because it was unjust. What's more, why does hell exist in the first place? I mean, if you want people to come to heaven, if you, as Peter said, lament every time someone goes to hell, you created a very piss-poor system for getting people into heaven because most people aren't Christians. Most people throughout history weren't Christians. So you created a system by which most people go to hell. You're either incompetent or you're evil. What's more, why does belief in this magnificent story have anything to do with whether or not people are worthy to get into heaven? Why could someone like Osama bin Laden, who led a life of carnage, have a deathbed conversion 5 minutes before he dies and wind up in heaven, when someone like me, who I can't remember the last time I stole something, I endeavor to never lie, I've certainly never killed someone, could wind up in hell for eternity for my honest opinion? You can't possibly come to me with that story and expect me to respect you as a moral agent. That's what I would say.
Okay, response to the question was if God came to you, and I think at least if God came with appropriate power, etc., you'd believe that it was actually God or some very, very great being. And if you said actually the Christian explanation of why...
I was conceding that when I responded, so we're there.
Right. But if they were to come to you and they were to say, well, this is actually why I did it, and the Christian explanation is right, I'm not being malicious, and hell isn't a place where I'm torturing people, it's a place where people experience torture because of separation from me, which is a result of who I am and my holiness, and you can't be in relationship with me given who you are and what you are. And for you to say, well, I don't agree with you, well, okay, I guess you could do that, but that's some audacity to say you don't have the right ethical system, God, when in fact from an atheist standpoint you have to recognize that your own ethical system is what happens to come out of your own head.
I just have one more quick question.
You want to go to one of theirs first, so we're not...
We're trying to go back and
booking.
forth.
Okay.
Just stay there, we'll get to you.
Awesome.
And I might use my opening to the next question to respond to that. No, I won't, that would be wrong.
Dr. Payne, I think everyone here wants to establish something in which people have to take responsibility for their actions. And my question for you is, how can we have an ethical system where people are motivated to perform morality right, when the very system you're proposing is that we instead of taking responsibility for our actions, we cast our responsibility off to a sacrifice of some sort, whether it be Jesus or a lamb in Hebrew Testament. How are we taking responsibility for our actions in any way if we're basically forcing someone else to suffer for us?
Yeah. We're asked to take responsibility for our actions all the time. So, at the beginning, when I talked about free will and responsibility implies we actually can do something about it. We have responsibility for that, but we cannot make ourselves pure. No matter how much I may try to be a better person, that can't make myself pure and holy. And if God's found a way within which He, in fact, can take the impurity, the selfishness which is in me and absorb it into Himself, and I can stand before God in God's holiness, I can't take responsibility for that as pure grace. So Christians emphasize that when it's where we go, whether in heaven or hell, it's the grace of God. It's not our relative goodness. In fact, if for our relative goodness, there'd have to be some cutoff point. So no matter how generous God would be, you would have people coming before God, and God would say, oh, you almost made it. If you'd just done a couple more good deeds, you would have made it, but you didn't, so to hell with you. It's not relative goodness. By God's standards, none of us are pure and holy. It's only by God's grace that any of us can come before a pure and holy God.
Hang on. I actually really liked your question. I think a God that lets someone else take the fall for your crimes is not a God that has any sense of justice. If I speed and they send you the speeding ticket, that's unjust. And it's even more unjust when you're talking about people winding up in hell or someone else dying who didn't do anything wrong. Peter says it's also not about goodness. It's not about how your goodness, it's about believing in Jesus to get you into heaven. If being a good person is not about goodness, and if justice is not about goodness, then I think that's also unjust. And I don't think any, and this sounds so derogatory, but I don't mean it that way, but any hand-waving about, God had to do X, Y, and Z. God's omniscient. He didn't have to do X, Y, and Z. He could have created a just system. The only explanation for an unjust system is that's the way God wanted it.
My second question is, as an atheist, do you believe in science, Darwinism, or what are your beliefs as an atheist?
Yes, I certainly think science is the greatest way for unmasking the mysteries of the universe that we've uncovered. Okay. A lot of times I hear from Christians when I say that faith is a terrible way to believe in anything, because there's nothing so ludicrously, so flagrantly at odds with reality that you couldn't defend it through faith. It's literally a license to believe in anything, no matter how ridiculous. A lot of times what I'll get is, ha ha ha, science is your faith. You have faiths too because you believe in science even though you don't understand it. Science makes one assumption, and that's that the universe operates under a set of rules. And if it's true, we should be able to test it, and we do test it. Every time we design an airplane that flies, every time we drop a rock and measure its rate of descent, every time we throw a satellite to the edge of our solar system and hit something the size of a pinhead. And after you test it enough times, it stops becoming a mere assumption about the way the world works and starts being a demonstrable fact about the way the world works. And so what gets me about religious people is I think they also treat the universe like it's consistent. For instance, even a Christian, if they walk by a stove one week and burn their hand on it, if they walk by the stove the next week, they're not going to put their hand on the stove because they assume the universe is consistent and they don't want to burn their hand again. And this is the way they orchestrate their lives up until it comes to claims about someone rising from the dead and walking on water. And then all of a sudden, consistency goes out the window. Not only do I think that religious people can do better than that and should do better than that, remember what I said about the parents who prayed for their child rather than calling a doctor. If you have good intentions, I think you have a moral obligation to be reasonable about the way the world works, to make sure that your good intentions are borne out in reality. And I think most people, Christians, Muslims, myself, have good intentions. And so when you start believing in things like people rising from the dead, walking on water, when you throw consistency out the window, I don't think that's just your personal beliefs. I think beliefs are the gatekeepers of actions, and actions affect everybody. So I'd say that your personal beliefs in that case, if you're not applying reason to them, are thoroughly immoral.
I'm not that familiar with science, but do you believe that human creation were from molecules and bacteria, or evolution of apes?
Well, if you think that evolution has anything to do with the origin of life, go read evolution. Evolution deals with the diversity of life, not the origin of life. And yes, I do believe it's true. There's mountains of evidence to confirm it's true. As far as abiogenesis and the origin of life, there are multiple models that are compliant with all of known science, like the RNA world model, that don't require any appeal to supernatural entities. It's not that life couldn't arise through natural processes, it's that we have a bunch of different models that could work, we don't know which one was responsible. So do I believe it's by natural means? Sure. Where there's a natural explanation, there's no need to appeal to magic or supernatural explanations.
Yeah, beliefs have to do not only facts, but also you believe certain values. And science doesn't give you any of those values. And to say, well, I'm not going to have faith, then you're not choosing to believe values, and values do involve beliefs. If they don't, they're awfully precarious. So I just want to add that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'd just like to ask, if you found out today definitively that there was no God, like 100%, then would you still stand by your moral code, and why?
If I definitively, which I wouldn't, but if I definitively found that God does not exist, would I stand by my moral code? Well, parts of it, because I've internalized a lot of it. You don't get rid of internalizing it. But when issues came up, when I have this balance of there's motivation to not stick by it, the fact that I no longer believe the things that used to undergird it makes it a lot easier for that to get overthrown. And so my whole point about beliefs, if you don't have beliefs that undergird your values, when you have motivation not to abide by that, it's awfully easy to give up on that. And that's something that we see continually for the atheist because he doesn't have the strong beliefs behind it.
To say that atheists don't have strong beliefs behind their morals is just frankly absurd. We believe that the study of germs is better for maximizing human happiness than, say, prayer. We believe that aerodynamics are a better way to achieve travel from one point to another than, say, prayer. In fact, pretty much every human innovation is a testament to the uselessness of prayer. And if prayer worked, we never would have invented anything. So when you talk about atheists having no beliefs, underlining our morality or what maximizes human happiness, no, we have tons of beliefs.
None of those are beliefs about values that he's mentioned. Sorry.
Okay, I believe that valuing equality leads to a more harmonious society. We have tons of beliefs that underscore our morality. It's just that one of them is not, there's a God somewhere telling us what to do. Although one of the things I believe about our morality is that even if there was a God somewhere telling us what to do, the moment he starts telling us to do malicious things, doesn't matter what he says. We should tell him to take a hike.
I just want to thank both of you, first of all, for giving time and coming here to enlighten us all. My question for you, JT, is in light of the law of cause and effect, how do you explain existence? What is the cause of existence if there is no God?
Well, for one thing, even if I have no clue, that doesn't mean that any religious person does. I mean, my ignorance is not tantamount to anybody else's knowledge. What's more, cosmologists have no idea how the universe formed, so even if we didn't know how the universe began, then that also wouldn't mean that a God existed. But as far as the laws in cause and effect, those only apply at the macro level. In terms of quantum mechanics, cause doesn't always equal effect. The decay of a radioactive nucleus has no effect. If you just got one atom, then it's a completely random process. Virtual particles are the same thing. But also, I could turn the question back on you. If everything that exists has a cause and effect, which I don't think it does, but even if it did, why does this not apply to God? I mean, you already believe that something can exist without a cause and effect. So as long as you already believe that, why not matter and the laws of physics, which produce order all by themselves, which have been the explanation for everything we've ever explained, and which we already know exist? Why is God not a superfluous variable in this equation?
If I'm understanding correctly, are you saying what is the cause of God?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm saying is you clearly already believe that something can exist without a cause. So as long as you admit that starting, why not matter and the laws of physics being the thing that exists without a cause, and why God?
Well, the natural world works through logic. I don't understand how there couldn't be a cause and effect. I can explain on a human level how there must be a cause and must be an effect. God is completely outside of logic. And for example, if you guys can try to grasp the idea of something outside of time, you literally can't imagine something outside of time, outside of logic, outside of the physical universe. It's impossible. Our brains are completely limited. I cannot explain the cause of God. I can explain the cause of us, but how could logic go outside of logic itself? I can't explain that.
There's a lot to say there. For one, it must be incredibly nice to hold your own beliefs to a different standard than you hold the explanations of others. Whereas logic is bound, my beliefs, yours, are outside of logic and are therefore, we're supposed to presume that they're more credible, which I don't. But if you say God exists outside of time and logic, how much sense does that make to assume that a God that exists outside of time would have any time to do anything, or a God that exists outside of matter would have any room to do it in? That's a completely incoherent concept. And what's more, consider how this argument would have looked before we, say, explained earthquakes. You could say that matter doesn't move itself, so there must be something outside of the laws of science, outside of logic, that was moving the earth. Of course, later we found out that it was just plate tectonics. But for what we haven't explained, why is a magic solution outside of logic, outside of all the constraints that govern everything else, a more likely explanation than there's simply a natural mechanic at work that we've not yet explained?
I would like to answer, but I'll give other people more time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Real
Thank
quick.
you.
If you go to my website, intelligentchristianity.org, you'll find an article called "What Caused God?" which addresses that question. When the question of where the universe came from, that is a serious question. Again, I give a talk on there's two options: either the universe had a beginning or it didn't have a beginning. If it had a beginning, that's a serious problem for science, because it's not just a matter of what caused it. You can't get something from absolutely nothing. A lot of physicists these days say that actually the universe always existed, some sort of cyclical view of the universe or a branching view of the universe. But if that's the case, there's a problem with the second law of thermodynamics. I'll be glad to talk to you about that. The other are serious problems, and simply saying we don't have an answer at this point. A person who is a more neutral person would say science doesn't have an answer. I shouldn't assume that it does. Religious people believe that God can do it, but we simply don't have an answer for that. I think that's the correct scientific explanation, is that we don't know at this point from a scientific standpoint.
I'm Mr. Deja Vu. I've got a couple questions now with, I have to change it because of the law of thermodynamics being brought out. I just want to clarify, what's your PhD and credentials for that? And what are all the laws of thermodynamics? I would kind of like to know. But that's sort of beside the point. My initial question is, I believe you could have a secular moral system independent of God with the concept of the social contract. People are born into the social contract. There's an obligation in that. When we look at secular institutions, let's say the U.S. government, I feel that it's far more moral than, let's say, a religious institution which claims an absolute truth, that there's a God that's commanding you to perform something that's absolute truth. There's no critical thinking. While for our own government, it says, First Amendment, if Christians try to make a connection with the commandments and our Constitution, well, there's a huge contradiction there. First commandment of God is worship only me, and the penalty is death.
Is there a question?
Yes. Here's my question. Basically, there appears to be a secular foundation for moral values that's superior to that of atheists, because you're claiming absolute truth, something you can't know.
A social contract is a conditional ought. In other words, it's only you ought to do it if you think that it's right to abide by the contract. You ought to obey the law only if you think that the law is the condition upon which it's not right because the law says so. But ethics does never stop to what a social contract is. The very notion of an ethical obligation goes above and beyond what people may think. Otherwise, what's right and wrong simply changes as the social contract changes. So infanticide can be morally right one day and morally wrong the next because the social contract changed. You may say, well, can society live that way? I think they can live that way. But as people, we really want to believe the things we're ordering our lives around are things which do matter, that there is a right and wrong. And I think that's true whether the person is an atheist or not. So the need for that is something which goes beyond social contracts, and social contracts is just simply conditional ought, whereas the ethical ought really is an unconditional ought.
I'm going to allow it to be.
He once again says that if human beings are creating moral rules, that right and wrong changes. No. When people all believed the earth was flat, was the earth actually flat? No, it was round, regardless. What maximizes human happiness is an objective fact about the universe. And just because we can be wrong on it doesn't mean that it stops being objective, that it's all of a sudden subjective. We change our opinions about science all the time, not because science is a subjective matter, but because our understanding of it has improved, ditto with morality. It's not us creating subjective rules, it's us figuring out better ways to maximize human happiness. It is objective, it is objective, it is objective.
My turn?
Yeah, go nuts.
It's more of a question for both of you. I consider myself a bit of an environmentalist. I try to care for animals, and so what about animals and the ethical dilemmas? Like, should we test animals for the sake of human goodness? I mean, you keep saying that it's human well-being, right? Human well-being. What about the animals? What about should we care about the environment? So that's one question. I have a second question, but I'm still thinking about it right now. It's a question for both, so wish there was a middle microphone, but there isn't.
I'll jump on it since you're in my line. There are gray areas of what maximizes human happiness. It's not like we can hook up a device to every moral action that measures how much happiness it's creating. In the case of how much we should care about the suffering of animals and compared to the suffering of humans, that can get into some kind of gray area there. This doesn't mean that a compassion-based moral system is wrong. It just means that it can be complicated and complex. In terms of should we test animals for what benefits human beings, personally, I'm on that boat. I think we should do it as humanely as possible. But ultimately, I think we experience pain and happiness to a greater level. Our consciences are of greater concern. And so, yeah, I'm all for testing animals when necessary.
Yeah, we're in agreement that human beings, from both of our perspectives, are more valuable than animals do. But God does care about animals. On the Sabbath rest observance, even your animals had to get a day of rest. You weren't supposed to be cruel to animals. So God does care about that, and that does enter in. But you can't simply say, well, science will tell us what's going to maximize happiness, compassion. And when we talk about is there an ought to care for animals, I think that ought doesn't come from somebody when the animals suffer, they ought to do something about it. It's only if that's a true value that you ought to do it. So if you believe you ought to care about animal suffering, it is an unconditional ought. It's not that somehow there's some truth that tells that I must do that, or that I must care about universal happiness. He says there's a fact about that. But there's no fact that I ought to care about universal happiness. That's an unconditional ought if it's an ought at all.
Thank you both for this great chat. I wanted to ask you to expand on a couple of things that you said in your remarks. One, that God never really hurt anyone that didn't deserve getting hurt, for instance. And I was thinking immediately of Noah's flood and children drowning slowly over 40 days. And also on something to the morality of that, the treatment that God gives everybody sort of equal treat, that is a Christian value to treat everyone sort of this in an equal way. And I wanted to know what Jesus said about slavery, for instance, because slavery was very prominent in those days. And what did God in general say about how bad slavery was? Because I personally have never been able to find anything that Jesus said that slavery was bad, even though there were slaves all over around him.
Yeah, it's not that God never hurt anyone. Typically when God's judgment comes, it's their destruction. You never find God sort of torturing people. No, that's no delight, but in fact God does judge, and sometimes judgment can mean their destruction. So in that sense, God can hurt people. The question about slavery, there are a number of things in the Old Testament which I think are instances where God doesn't completely eliminate the institution which is there. It's so built into the culture that it's there, but there's lots of things which are the seeds of the undoing of it which is there. So, for instance, if a runaway slave that came to you in the Old Testament, the assumption was he must be being mistreated, abused, so you were not to return him to his master. And the reminder was that you remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and you're to treat other people with that kind of dignity and respect. So even though slavery is not abolished in the Old Testament, there are lots of rules put in place to make it a less evil institution than it was. And when you get the New Testament, it's quite clear that there's the momentum is in that direction, to where Paul says, if you have the opportunity to become free, certainly do. And he says to the master, remember, as a master, you are both subject to God. Your slave, who you're responsible for, is also subject to God. You're on no different terms in terms of your relationship with God. You're equals before God. And that sort of paves the way to where now we say slavery ought to be abolished, even though it wasn't abolished initially. The seeds of its overthrow are there to begin with.
The Old Testament clearly condones slavery. And not only does it condone slavery, it talks about how to treat your slaves and the extent to which you can beat them. If ever there was a place we could converge on our moral interests, this should be it. But we can't entirely. Peter said that God never hurt anyone. What about any child born with a disability? What about the appendix, which creates a scant amount of white blood cells, but you'd never miss it if it wasn't there? But for some people, it's just a ticking time bomb or wisdom teeth. God is either malicious in his design or incompetent. And as far as the moral rules you talked about, David, why does God never tell us himself? Look at all the other religions where human beings are running around saying, this is God's will, this is God's will, and we all look at them and say, why isn't God telling us? Why does God talk to you and not me? That's not fair. If God values everybody equally, why is he talking to some people and not me? That's not right. So I'm not convinced that, that God's moral rules are so immutable. He also said that God abhors torture. How many of you can look at a picture of a starving child, and just the picture, and it tugs at your heart? I know my heart sinks when I look at that stuff. I mean, for me, if I was there and if I had the means to feed the millions of starving children like the one in that picture, I would do it. Easy. If I had the means, I would do it. God has the means. And the moment it falls to me to give that child an orange, I'm doing what God is either unwilling to do or unable to do. So you can't say that God abhors pain or torture, otherwise he never would have invented hurricanes, and he would make hell some kind of purgatory rather than some place where you burn for all eternity.
Thank you.
Can I go again?
Well, first, I just want to point out that it has been about 25 minutes. I'm not stopping anything, but I want to acknowledge that time is finite. Maybe we should agree. Maybe we should agree that the people standing will be it. Is that a reasonable way to go?
I'm okay with that. Peter?
Okay. Sure. Okay. Now, I think maybe though you should let the people behind you go before you go.
Thanks. Hi, JT.
Hi. I'm always nervous of people like you, like, hi, JT, like, oh, this person's going to own me. She is not scared enough.
I like your initials. First of all, I am a Christian, and I would be the first person to break all the rules if Christianity was nothing but a bunch of do's and don'ts, because I'm volunteering to do the sin because it's fun. I rely on God's grace every day, and I'm telling you without a doubt that he lives in me. Thank God I have a purpose in this world. Thank God there's a reason that I'm here. If I believed that the only reason I was on this earth was to act like a nice person and to try to please myself, I'd give up today. So I ask you, what do I tell my friends who are non-believers, who are sad and lonely and miserable, compared to my Christian friend who died of cancer, who asked God to heal him? He didn't, but he was at more peace in his life because he knew he was going to be with his Lord and Savior.
When you say God lives in you,
Yes.
I would ask you to give me, okay, because we both agree that Muslims are not believing anything true. For Christianity to be true, this has to be the case. Literally for every other religion, they have to be false for you to be right. Now, if you were to put one member from each faith up next to you, all of which who would say, like, my personal experience is God lives in me, now they're all genuinely mistaken or lying. What separates you from them in terms of credibility? In fact, if the starting probability of someone saying that is already very, very high in terms of their lying, mistaken, or crazy, why not, what keeps me from saying this of all of them, including you, as sincere as I believe you are? And I'm going to get to the rest of your stuff, so sorry, I know there's other people that want to ask questions. You said you have a purpose and a reason to be here.
Yes.
So does every atheist. It's just not a cosmic, significant purpose. My purpose to be here is to win at League of Legends someday. Some days. It's to look at the stars and understand how they work. The purposes I have in my life are established by me, not by a God. So I don't think being an atheist leaves you bereft of purpose. It just gives you your own purpose, which I think is a lot more beautiful, personally. And you said that if the only reason you were here was to pursue happiness, what's wrong with happiness? What's wrong with pursuing happiness? Why isn't that enough? I mean, happiness isn't meaningless just because it's temporary. And the last thing you said is, what would you say to the atheists who are miserable? First off, let's get rid of this idea that atheists are all miserable or that Christians are all happy. Many Christians are miserable, many atheists are happy. So what I say to them when they're miserable, I would say to them that it can get better. There are avenues to happiness in this world, and there are happinesses to be had that don't involve sacrificing our reason at the altar of faith. I realize that believing in various religions can make people happy and change their lives, but that says nothing to the truth of those religions. And if you believe that being reasonable is a moral obligation, then that should worry you. I would say you don't need to believe that a God is watching over you to be happy. In fact, for some people, whether they're gay or whether they go to sleep at night fearing hell, believing those things can often be a route to unhappiness. So what I would say to them is, it's a fact about the universe, given our understanding of psychology, given our understanding about how happiness works in the real world, that you can get happy. And you don't need to do it by believing in absurd things like people rising from the dead. And when I say that, please don't think I'm calling you an idiot. Yeah, I'm not, but I am being frank.
Okay. First of all, I think it's very responsible to be educated in religions. I believe Christianity is the only religion that you're saved by grace, not by deeds. There was a couple other things I wanted to, my point is, what would be when the earth burns up, what does it matter if you just lived here for so many years and you were, quote, happy? And another thing, the Bible actually does promise that we will go through hard times. Absolutely, a guarantee. And God, my purpose in this world is actually not to be happy. My purpose in this world is to serve my Lord and Savior, and I hope that the world sees His light in me. I will absolutely fail every day, but thank God I'm forgiven. Amen.
Okay, I'm going to do.
Can I just ask that we try to hold to one question each, just in fairness to the rest of the people standing here?
I'll keep my answers there really, really fast. It's good to be educated about religions. I agree. I actually abandoned Christianity when I read through the Bible for the first time. I literally flipped over the last page and said, I don't believe any of this. So I think reading the Bible actually creates atheists. In fact, in 2010, Pew released a study that showed that atheists on the whole actually knew more about the various religions than the adherents of those religions themselves. So I'm all for being educated about religions. You say that Christianity is the only faith where you're saved by grace, not by needs. One, it's not true. But even if it were, so what? That only demonstrates that Christianity is different, not that it's true. You said when the earth burns, what does it all matter? It doesn't. The happiness matters here and now in this life to me, and just because it's temporary doesn't mean that it's meaningless. I mean, are you married? Was that day meaningless just because it was a temporary thing? Right.
Actually, the only reason why I'm still married is because of my faith.
I would rather it be because he makes you happy.
I think,
and you said the Bible says we'll go through hard times. Everybody of every faith goes through hard times. The Bible might as well have said the sky is blue. It doesn't mean that the Bible has divine insight. It means it can look at things in the real world and be like, yep, that's how it is. And you said that your purpose to be here is to serve your Lord. If that makes you happy, I'm sure that makes it a lot easier.
my two quick responses are to believe this ridiculous rose from the dead only makes sense if you think science tells us that miracles cannot happen. And I'll give you a very good argument if you want. I can talk to you about it. The science does not tell us that. It doesn't tell us whether there's anything supernatural. It tells us how the world normally works. It doesn't tell us where there are no exceptions. The thing about the meaning that she has in her life is all of us, the way in which we're built as people, is we need to have moral significance and meaning in our life. And regardless of whether or not you want to dismiss the Christian faith and simply, I'll live for happiness, that is not meaning. the psychological studies, so the people who are happy are people who do things they believe are meaningful, significant, and not simply what bring their own happiness. So you're actually pursuing a course which ironically will not bring about the greatest happiness for yourself.
In contrast to lack of knowledge, we'll say lack of knowledge of the Bible. For instance, as we're all sitting here this evening, we all experienced social development. The moderator began the talk by saying, please hold your applause to the very end. Those of us who were in the room at the time, we heard that, we received that, and we responded accordingly. A couple of minutes later, so-and-so trickled in, somebody finished their debate, and that person felt moved, and they wanted to clap. Funny, they were the only person clapping, and then a couple other people kind of clapped to kind of go along with it.
What's the question? I'm not sure.
Does that change the original law, the original request? You know, do we make an exception for those people who came in late because of what they felt? So I guess what I'm asking is that contrast of the flaw in social development, and I believe we live in like a current state of a flaw of lack of biblical knowledge. Therefore, it's distasteful, you know, to people because they don't know what it says. Well, just like the people didn't know what the moderator said. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, when we don't know that something is wrong, we're not held responsible for it. A person who doesn't know this is a rule, there's no responsibility for that. For other people who go ahead and do it, and I didn't slow things down, but in fact, I think in a debate, to clap for your side is rudeness rather than just simply letting the people speak. But that's a minor thing. But we do have those are things sort of rules for our community here, but those aren't ethical rules. So it's not unethical. It's sort of conditional. We want to abide by what's going on here. So I'm not quite sure they get the question or I'm not sure I answered the question.
Honestly, I'm giving you an opportunity to speak to the comparison of people who don't understand or know the scriptures.
Oh, okay.
And staking a claim there and doing as they feel.
God never judges us for what we don't do with what we don't have. He judges us for what we do have. And Paul says we all have at least the law written on our heart. Mm-hmm. So we have that conscience. God doesn't hold us accountable for what we don't do when we don't have it. But unfortunately, all of us have plenty that in fact condemn us in terms of our own selfishness, and we all recognize that we don't even meet our own standards.
And where we're ignorant, we thrive less. That's why every generation has worked to peel away human ignorance, and we've become a happier and more thriving society on account of it, and we'll continue to do that. But it's ironic, as we remove ignorance from the human condition, how much smaller that makes God. I mean, think for a moment. Can you think of a problem for which we once had a religious solution, but then later had a scientific solution? I mean, think geocentricity. I mean, there are tons of them. But now try to think of a problem for which we once had a scientific solution, but for which we now have a religious solution. None. Science, as we remove ignorance, we are eroding away religion, and have been ever since science came onto the scene.
So I know that an issue that at least some people have with religion is that they may believe that it's the cause of a lot of different conflicts, e.g. terrorism, something like that. But then I just curious, well, what would you think of the statement, don't blame the tool, blame the person who uses it? And I think you might agree, well, to quote a song from Weird Al Yankovic, I sued Home Depot because they sold me a hammer which they knew I might drop on my toes. That's a pretty ridiculous reason to sue someone. So it's like, well, I mean, why blame the religion? Wouldn't you blame the people who were using it in the wrong way?
Is there a right way for any particular religion that doesn't invoke the use of faith or believing in things for bad reason? Because I don't think there is. And my position is that when people with good intentions do terrible things, because I'm even willing to admit that many terrorists have good intentions. They think they're fighting injustice and making for a better world. The problem is they have bad ideas to support that, and so even though they have good intentions, they wind up being monsters. Now, do I think religion is the only source of bad ideas? No, not at all. People have political bad ideas that also lead to them doing monstrous things. The nub I have with religion is that in every other discipline, when people are wrong, they're at least attempting to be right. But in religion, people have this concept of faith that can allow them to believe any ludicrous thing regardless of whether or not it's reasonable. It takes away that burden of reason. So that's why religion gets most of my attention. So when you say don't blame the tool, anytime someone's asserting that faith is a good way to arrive at conclusions about the way the universe works, that's a bad tool, and it is to blame. So I don't think you can exempt religion in this case. In fact, I have a blog. Let's imagine you had a blog. Let's hold a cartoon contest. You can have people submit cartoons of any religious figure. No, I can have people submit cartoons of any religious figure, and you have to do cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. Now, at worst, I'll get some email that is angry at me for being insensitive. You would be far more likely to get threats on your life. And this isn't happening in any other religion and in any other cultures. So to say that religion is just completely, it's a tool that people are misusing, is really hard for me to buy because you can see its effects in the cultures that adopt those religions.
Well, thanks for your insight. Good to have thoughts about it.
Thank you for your quiet skepticism.
The caricature of people of religion just simply doing insane, crazy, stupid things out of faith. You must not know very many intelligent Christians to actually think that's the case. There are things which we believe because God has revealed it to us, but we have reasons for believing that God's revealed to us, and the things that we act upon are not insane and crazy. And if you looked at the result of people acting on what we believe as Christians in our society, that's a huge influence of why we are what we are today. And going back to sort of, don't kill what if I gave you what you want, the Christian faith and the values that it has been enormously important in molding our culture, and to simply blame it as being ignoramuses who believe things on faith. No, in fact, there's a combination of faith and reason in all of us, and there ought to be, and it's not the case that we believe things blindly by faith with no reason whatsoever.
Hi. All right, so you said that even when God does malicious things, apparently malicious things, that his will is still good and that we just don't understand that. But if God is beyond human understanding, how is it possible for you or any other religious person to be qualified to speak for God or to form your own interpretations of the Bible that aren't literal?
Yeah, I'm taking what the Bible says about God. If a person says God is malicious, the Bible never says that. It is true that there are two sons of Eli who are sort of hanky-panky, sort of doing their own thing with the incense and not doing the things in the temple the way they're supposed to do it, and God struck them down. Fire came from heaven and consumed them. Well, was God being malicious? Well, he was certainly being severe on people who weren't taking the temple seriously and weren't taking coming before God seriously. But to interpret as malicious is to imply something in God which we don't have there. And if we say, well, we can't know what God is actually like, well, the only basis we have is what Scripture actually says about it. And it's quite clear from what Scripture says that God isn't malicious. So to say it's apparently malicious is imputing our sort of feelings upon God, when in fact I don't know what feelings are like in God. I know that when God is opposed to evil and there's destruction upon it, it'll feel like wrath. But I have no clue as to what the wrath of God feels like to God, other than he's adamantly opposed to what's evil and is acting against it.
You said the Bible never says that God is malicious. If you think the being that conceived of cancer or hurricanes or starving children or Down syndrome is not malicious, if someone's telling you it's not malicious, that person is lying to you. I mean, a person can have a child born without arms and think it's part of God's plan and God is not malicious. However, if a person were to cut off a healthy child's arms, that person would be a monster by human standards. I don't see why the standards change for God. And this is the problem. Once you start saying that whatever God does is by definition good, you can excuse him of complete atrocities that would land any other human being in prison at best.
The definition of faith is that it is a belief that is not based on proof. And so my question is, doesn't one have to have a certain amount of faith that the universe was just happened on its own in terms of that definition?
Sure. It's impossible to be absolutely certain about any belief. I mean, that we're in this room is a pretty solid belief, but there's a scant chance that we could be heads in a jar somewhere being fed this experience about the universe. So what we consider to be knowledge or good beliefs are just the positions that are best supported by the evidence around us, even though we're never absolutely sure, and leaving that little doubt open so we can then later change our minds. Now, when you say faith is belief without proof, that's a problem. I don't believe that stars form through the process called the genes instability just without any proof. The evidence is there. Now, some evidences are better than other evidences, but what the problem with religion, I find, is that when they utilize faith, they don't use it in the way you defined it. They use it to say belief even though the evidence contradicts their position. Because let's face it, nobody worries about burying their dead relatives for fear they'll reanimate. Even Christians accept that people don't generally rise from the dead. I mean, that's why it's called a miracle in Jesus' case. What they do is believe that the consistency of the universe and the laws of nature were suspended so that their beliefs can be true. Now, you can either believe that the universe is consistent, in which case the science we use to create microphones and cell phones and airplanes makes complete sense, or it's not. And I would argue that all the evidence we have is towards a consistent universe, and religious people use faith to get around that. And frankly, the consistency of the universe is what we use to establish if people are right or wrong. If you tell me that, for instance, you can feed a starving child by amputating their left foot, it's easy for me to disprove that. All of the proof is on my side, and anybody agreeing with you would be out of their mind and wrong. But yet if you tell me someone rose from the dead, even though all the evidence is on my side, now all of a sudden faith is noble, and it's not the definition you use. And when you're using faith to get around the burden of actually having evidence, or even the burden of conforming to the evidence we have, I'm trying to phrase this nicely, and I'm not a nice person. I would say not only is that irresponsible, but that I don't think it's terribly wrong to expect religious people to do better.
To assume that whenever a disease or cancer like that happens, as God is inflicting it upon the person is not a biblical notion, and it's something which Christians wrestle with, and to say it's the same thing as God zapping the two sons of Eli by fire, no, that's not the case. And why does God not intervene? There's lots of good Christian responses that the Christians give to that. You can go to my website for a response to it. When you say that science says that no exceptions can ever take place, what science tells you is how the world normally runs. Science can tell you how babies normally take place, but science can never tell you that there's no supernatural being. And science can never tell you that the supernatural being never makes exceptions unless that supernatural being chooses to make them often enough that scientists will simply stumble across them. So the success of science is explained as it understands how the world works. I think the way the world normally works, there are no gaps in it whatsoever, that God has created an exquisitely ordered world. But that does not tell us that God never makes exceptions. And there's this jump from thinking, well, we understand how things normally work within the world, so therefore God never makes exceptions. That is not a warranted exception. It's not a rational assumption, and he keeps making that assumption. And it's appealing to something which goes contrary to science, which it doesn't.
Earlier, JT, you asked Peter if God were evil, like if he completely switched his value system, so that evil was what was ethical. I'm assuming that was that.
Let me phrase it for you to make sure we're on the same page.
Okay.
What I said was, if you found out today that whatever standards got you into heaven actually landed you in hell, and whatever standards got you into hell actually landed you in heaven, how would your behavior change? I wasn't making moral judgments, I was just changing the facts of the universe around.
Okay, so let's say that that universe exists. How would it perpetuate itself? Because we've now said that murder is okay, and we can go around murdering everybody. So soon everyone's going to be dead. I don't understand how the universe would protect.
I wasn't making that argument. That's why it's a hypothetical. A world in which we consistently murder each other is a world where human beings would have died off, which is the reason we'd expect us to evolve compassion and sympathy. And actually, I can talk about why biologists think that center of our brain evolved. But that's actually evidence for my position, that the natural rise of compassion is what we see, not what's given to us by God.
Okay, and then what were you saying on that? Because I'm still really confused by it. I don't understand if you completely switch it, how your universe will continue.
Don't worry about that. That's why it's a hypothetical. The universe wouldn't continue.
JT was trying to say you're motivated by rewards. You're motivated to go to heaven, to go to hell. But part of the reason I refuse to respond to it is I'm told you'll go to heaven because you've done all these evil, terrible things. Why should I think one who's telling me this, who's switching the worlds around, heaven's going to be anything like he says that? It's just to think, no, there's going to be sort of a moral order there when there's no moral order here. It's an absurd question, and to put it that way, no, and I'm not motivated by rewards. There's some motivation that I have, that yes, I do want to have life after this, but I'm strongly motivated by my relationship with God and desiring to please Him. And to think that from the atheist standpoint, that Christians are only motivated by eternal rewards or eternal punishment is to greatly misconstrue the understanding of Christian motivation. It's part of it. It's part of motivation, but the fear of the Lord, those kind of motivations, are almost always short-term. It's not the kind of motivation that makes us the kind of people God wants us to be.
Thank you.
Can we thank our two speakers, Peter Payne, JT Eberhard? Thanks for coming, and once again, there are materials on the tables on the way out, and if you're interested in a DVD or a Blu-ray of this presentation, you can sign up. Thanks.